Welcome to the Classic Cinema Society podcast. I'm your host, Christopher Pistol. Every episode, I bring on a guest to discuss a classic movie, and we talk about its place in cinema history and how they remain relevant today. Today, we're talking about L'Avventura from 1960. This film was chosen by my guest, Dr. Bruce Hutchinson. Bruce, thanks for joining me today.
Hey, I am super excited to be here. I'm honored to be a guest, and I think we're going to have a lot of fun discussing one of my all-time favorite movies, L'Avventura.
Well, the honor is all mine. You were my film professor for a few years. You're probably the person I know who has seen the most films.
I've seen a lot. My letterbox is closing in on 5,000 narrative feature films. I don't put documentaries on there, and I don't put shorts on there.
Wow.
For whatever reason, because
I totally cheat, and I totally put short films on there just to beef my numbers up.
Well, I started keeping a list of the movies I had seen when I was a teenager. And so I have had a running list for a very long time in my life. Also deleted it at least once by mistake and had to reconstruct it. But yes, I have seen a lot of movies.
All right. Well, let's talk a little bit about that before we dive into L'Avventura. So tell our audience a little bit about yourself and sort of about your film journey.
Okay, yeah. So, I mean, my film journey does go back to probably when I was a teenager. It's when I really started getting into movies. I was one of those 80s kids who, got a camcorder. And what I used to do for fun with my friends was go make ridiculous, spoofs of movies like The Natural or do the Star Trek episodes or whatever. But there was definitely a couple of formative things in my journey. I grew up in Sarasota, Florida, and when I was in high school, they actually started a film society there. So you didn't have to join, but they started showing, like foreign movies in the movie theater, or one of the movie theaters in town. So like I was already being exposed to that, which was pretty unusual for that time period. And then, of course, I was also raised during the the heyday of the video store in the
Comes up a lot on this show.
Yeah, and there was an independent video store in my town called Renaissance Video, and there was a guy named Bill who ran it, and I would go in and rent stuff, and he started. He was the one who started suggesting, "Hey, you might like this," and he first really got me going on. Because he wanted to, I think, to get me introduced to foreign films, but foreign films that he thought I might like. So he started showing me some of the Cinema du Look movies of the 1980s. And so I was watching like Subway and Diva and Betty Blue and stuff like that. And so like that was like my sort of introduction to foreign movies, The Big Blue as well, and and so that kind of got me set up. And so yeah, then when I went off to college, I decided to study film, and that's been my life ever since.
And you're a filmmaker as well, and you're all right. You made a film just pretty recently, back in 2023.
Yeah, so actually we shot it in 2021. It's called Mountain Flowers, and I actually technically have it online, but I haven't really shared that with anyone yet. But I'm going to this summer because I've sort of started a website that I hope to get other people's films on, sort of a grassroots sort of distribution kind of thing. So I know at the end you sort of ask about stuff like that. So sure. I will plug that at the end and let you know so you can get a chance to watch it. So yeah, I'm a filmmaker and a film buff and love watching movies and making movies.
I don't know if you have any siblings, but I know me personally, I didn't have an older brother when I was younger to teach me the ways of like media or anything like that, or introduce me to anything. So everything I sort of had to discover on my own. And I definitely also had a video clerk that like let me borrow their like copy of nothing is nothing really artsy, but like the extended edition of Lord of the Rings or something like
Right,
that.
right,
Like
right.
stuff we couldn't get a hold of. But how did that sort of transition into? Did that was that really like your sort of gateway into like even classic cinema or older cinema? And how did you feed that?
Yeah, so I mean, just being able to have access to those movies. I mean, I was still super into Hollywood movies, and I loved like Raiders of the Lost Ark and stuff like that. And I actually had a tradition with my friends where during finals week, every year we'd skip school during like the period where we didn't have a final, and we go to the movies and we'd pick some movie to go see. Um, so, but then I started, through Bill's help and his video store, because it was an independent video store. I mean, he had all kinds of great foreign stuff, and I don't even remember all the stuff that I saw when I was in high school. So then when I went to college, um, I was studying film production, but I was also taking, film studies classes as well. And probably the next big thing that really got me going was I took an entire class on Ingmar Bergman, and so
Well,
we watched a Bergman film every week. So and
wow.
almost all of those were on film,
Oh my gosh.
and so I watched, I don't know, semesters felt a little longer then, so I probably watched 15 or 16 Bergman films. I mean, I watched three-quarters of his filmography probably.
Hmm.
Well, I shouldn't say that, because he had like a whole bunch of movies that he made before he got to like Summer with Monica, and the movies that like started being his like well-known movies. He'd made like 10 movies before then. I've only seen one or two of those, but anyway, the point is that like I watched a bunch of Bergman movies. And then the other thing is that I was going to school at American University in Washington, D.C. And so I went from a town that had a film society where there was like
Right.
one film a week to a big city with multiple theaters that
Yeah.
only showed indie movies and foreign movies. And and so I mean, even going into my freshman and sophomore year, I mean, the movies that I was able to see in the theater, I remember seeing oh gosh, what is Pedro Maldivar's movie after Tie Me Up, Tie Me Down?
Oh, is it all about my mother?
No, before that.
Ooh.
It's
Only
gonna.
Natalie were here, she would know.
Um, I'll look it up, but yeah, I also saw like um, The Cook, the Thief, the Wife, and His Lover in the
Mm,
theater. I saw, and this is over the 4 years I was in school. I saw Paris is Burning in the theater. Women on the Verge of a Nervous Breakdown. That's
there
the
you
one.
go.
Of,
That's pretty lucky. I mean, I grew up in a small town that had, a couple of video stores because there were plenty of video stores back in the day, but the selection was pretty limited to like movies from the 80s, and
yeah,
most of them did not have a big art house section.
yeah,
So I really was kind of ignorant of a lot of world cinema and classic films until I went to college and kind of started taking classes on it. And I think that's like still the case for a lot of people. Like even though we don't have video stores around anymore, people are still pretty limited to what their streaming subscription shows them, and still like
yeah,
classic
yeah,
cinema
yeah,
and
yeah.
foreign cinema
Yeah,
doesn't get highlighted a lot.
it's strange because the access to those movies is now there in a way that was never there when I was in college. But
Yeah,
you got to be led there, kind of like what you were saying
right.
with your video store
You've got to
clerk.
seek it out.
You have to seek it out, or you have to have someone who points you in that direction, which of course is one of the great things about being a professor is that I can be that force for introducing students to those kind of movies. But yeah, living in a big city where I had access to theaters that were playing those kind of movies was great. I wouldn't say that when I was in DC, weirdly, there wasn't like that I knew of a really great video store. So I just went to Blockbuster, but even a
Hmm.
Blockbuster in DC still had a decent
Right. They're still
foreign
going to have,
section
yeah.
compared to, a lot of other
Hmm.
towns. So between that and being in school, I was exposed to all kinds of experimental movies. I had a whole class on experimental film, or we're watching Stan Brakhage and Maya Deren. And then, of course, just I was mostly taking film production classes. They were sort of a separate cinema studies major, but I still managed to take some classes where I was learning that. So yeah, just through all of those means, and then of course I went to grad school to get a PhD.
Yeah.
So I had 5 years of grad school where I was learning even more about global cinema. As well as national cinema. I should say when I was in DC, by the way, I was also lucky to see like 2001 in 70 millimeter and see Blade Runner in 70 millimeter and like
Yeah.
see some really cool stuff. But yeah, then I went to grad school and just kept expanding my knowledge. And again, I was lucky. I went to the University of Kansas, which had I mean, I had a number of movie theaters, but it did have an independent movie theater called Liberty Hall that showed foreign movies and in indie movies. So, like I saw Breaking the Waves there,
Mm.
Lars von Trier's masterpiece. So I guess I've been really lucky to always be places and to have mentors and instructors to really, broaden my range and help me keep, learning more and more about cinema. And of course, that's been a lifelong pursuit. I mean, even if you look at my letterbox right now, you'll see that I'm like watching a bunch of Robert Bresson movies that I've never seen before. So like I'm always trying to fill in all those gaps, and
Yeah.
there's so many great movies. I was joking with I mentioned Casey Floyd before we started, but another former student. I was joking with him yesterday that if no if no good movies starting today, if there were no good movies ever
Right.
made ever again, you would still have a lifetime of good movies to
Oh yeah.
watch between
Oh yeah.
classic Hollywood and international
Yeah.
movies. There's the
There
list. There's just so many movies.
there
So
are almost times when I'm thinking like they could just stop, and I think I think I'd be okay. At least I'd be able to catch up. Like
it's
even if
weirdly daunting
cinema
because it's
dies.
like you want to stay current with what's coming out, and
Yeah.
then you're still trying to catch up with what came out in the past.
Yeah.
And of course, the younger you are, or I guess the more time passes, the more
Hmm.
movies in the past you have to catch up on as
Yeah.
well as keep up with the present. So
I was
sometimes it's
also I was also
yeah,
thinking about this the other
overwhelming.
day that the older I get, the less my desire to like watch. I have friends who watch everything that's new. Um, you know, they go to the theaters every single weekend and watch some
Right.
multiple movies a week. And the older I get, the like less desire I have to do that, or to at least like see everything and stay up on what's new. And I
Yeah.
really just want to go back and fill in, like you said, those gaps and watch old stuff. But I also think to myself, I thought this the other day. I thought like, oh, but can you imagine like if I was, someone growing up in the 70s and they're not going to see like the new Kubrick, or like
Right. Right.
they're not, it's like, oh, you missed out on seeing 2001 in the theater because when it came out, because you were busy watching,
Right. Stuff from the
Buster Keaton
past.
or whatever.
Well, I mean, I think, hopefully you try to figure out what the best stuff is that's contemporary and at least watch
Mhm.
that. But, the implication, which I
Yeah,
think you're right about, is it does feel like there's more and more forgettable movies that is just like, well, why am I going to bother to watch this when there's so many great movies I could be watching? For me as a professor, I don't know if it's fortunate or not, but I try to keep up even with those movies. I went and watched Thunderbolts this morning. I had
yeah,
because I had some free time, and I was like, I don't know that I care that much, but I also know that I still have students who live and die by Marvel. Less than I did
sure.
5 years ago, or less than I did 10 years ago, but I still have that, and so I still want to be conversant with my students in the things that they're watching. So I do feel this pressure to kind of watch a lot of
Yeah.
contemporary movies, whether I think they're going to be
Hmm.
that good or not. And
I
of course, sometimes it's fun to watch stupid movies too. I mean,
Oh yeah, for
I
sure.
love movies, and so
Yeah,
I'm happy to watch movies that I know aren't going to be the best movie because
sure.
I still love it. I still love going to the movie theater. Although I watch most of my movies at home, I still like going to the movie theater too when I can.
I appreciate your striving to stay relevant. When I was an undergrad, I had a film professor who was not you, and I won't say who it was, but he was making sort of like references to mostly television, to techniques and things that he saw on television, and the class said something along the lines of like, "Oh yeah, they did something like that in Scott Pilgrim, which was I think it just come out like a year
Right.
or so before," and he was like, "Oh, I haven't seen that."
Yeah.
And we mentioned another movie, and he was like, "Oh, again, I haven't seen that recently," and you could feel the class collectively start to turn on him.
Yeah. Well, and part of the way I teach my class, and of course you've been in my classes, but like especially when I teach my undergrad class, we'll be talking about some aspect of like narrative structure or something, and I'll say, okay, someone give me an example of this.
Mhm.
And part of my ability to teach the class is when someone throws out an example from some movie they've seen, I've got to have seen that movie 8 or 9 times out of 10. It's
Yeah.
okay if occasionally I say, oh, I haven't seen that movie. Tell us or explain that example. But most of the time when they're like, oh yeah, this movie, they do this, I need to be able to know that movie and be able to be like, oh yeah, that's a great example, and then sort of explain to the class how that works. So it does keep me on my toes, and I am sort of thankful in a sense because it keeps my curiosity going. It keeps me wanting to know what's in the theaters now and what my students are watching, and if they mention something that I haven't seen, a lot of times I do try to go and watch it.
Let's go ahead and dive into La Ventura. So, what's your sort of relationship with this film? Was this one that you saw in the early days when you were seeing stuff in theaters and seeing like classic films
It
in
wasn't, and
theater?
actually, it's kind of a funny story in terms of continuing sort of the conversation that we were just having, because after I got my PhD, I bounced around a little bit. I lived in Atlanta briefly, and then I moved back to Kansas, and then I got married, and not to Christy, who I'm married now, but my first wife. We moved to Alaska, and
What?
so yes, and so everything I was just talking about access to movies and this ability to how lucky I was. I'm in 19 no 2000 in 2000 I moved to Alaska. Well, right before I moved to Alaska, um, this new service started. This service where people would send you DVDs to your house.
I think I've heard of it.
Yes,
Sounds
it was
familiar.
called Netflix. And I signed up for Netflix, and it kind of saved my life because there was a pretty decent video store in Fairbanks, Alaska, where I lived. But right, like, I mean, I was one of the first. I mean, I don't know when Netflix first started, but I mean, it couldn't have been more than a year or so before that, where
Yeah.
I was getting, and yes, they sent DVDs to Alaska. And so I moved to
Awesome.
Alaska in the summer, and I was going to be teaching a couple of classes as an adjunct. My wife was getting her master's degree there, and so I had just come with her, and so I managed to pick up a few classes. And so I started getting movies from Netflix, and one of the very first DVDs I rented from Netflix was La Ventura. Um, and so yeah, I've unfortunately I've never seen it on the big screen. I've only ever seen it on TV. But yeah, that's how I watched it. It was August or something in Alaska, and I got the DVD in the mail, and I watched it, and I was blown away. I absolutely loved it.
Yeah. Well, this was also the first. Well, this was the first time I've seen this film, and it's always been on my watch list. I sort of think of this as like one of the big, like early Criterion films. Like
Right,
this is
right.
from an era of very specific European art house films that you kind of just have to see at some point, and it's kind of always been on my list, and I've kind of always and I've read about this film. I've watched clips of this film, um, and so I basically knew what it was about going into it, and kind of somewhat knew what to expect. Um, but I found it probably more beguiling than I ever thought I would. So let's talk a little bit about, I guess, if you want to talk about Antonioni and this sort of. I wrote down I've always thought of this or heard about this as an Italian neo-realist film, but it's
But
sort
it's
of,
not.
but it's not. Yeah, it sort of bucks up against that a little
It
bit.
really isn't. It really isn't a neo-realist film, and so I think there's, and you had it in our notes, and I think there's a couple of things to sort of set up in terms of when it came out and kind of what was happening in cinema at that time. So first of all, it came out in 1960, which might be one of the greatest years in the
Yeah,
history of cinema. And
this
if
is
we
not the
look,
first 1960 film we've talked about on this show.
yeah, and especially if you go like 1959 and 1960. You're talking about 400 Blows playing at
Hmm.
Cannes in 1959. You're talking about Hiroshima Mon Amour playing at Cannes in 1959. In 1960, La Ventura plays at Cannes. La Dolce Vita, Fellini's movie, plays at Cannes. The Virgin Spring by Bergman plays at Cannes. And then, of course, it may be the most famous still now movie from 1960 doesn't play at Cannes, which is Breathless. It's got all those movies that came out around 1960, and so it's really, really amazing. What happened, how many of those movies came out. So La Ventura plays at Cannes, and it gets booed. It gets booed mercilessly by the audience
Which
because
how
it
you
is
know it's
something.
good.
Yeah, because it is something different. It's something unique and different. Um, it then also wins the jury prize. Um, and the quote that went with it was a pretty famous quote now. It received the jury prize for the beauty of its images and for seeking to create a new film language. And I think that starts to get us, I mean, that's still really vague, but maybe it starts to move us towards, okay, this was something completely new and
Hmm.
different in 1960. And I think a big part of why, well, I think a big part of our conversation, focus on, well, what made it new, what was so unique about this movie,
Hmm.
that sort of blew people away. Uh, so I'm sure you're also familiar with the Sight and Sound poll that comes out. Um, the best 100 movies on every decade ending in two, right?
Right,
1962,
right, right.
1972, 1982. So gets booed at Cannes in 1960. In 1962, it is named the second best movie of all time. Two
Crazy.
years later. I mean, that's how influential it was
Yeah.
and how much it showed people what cinema was capable of that people hadn't really thought about before 1960. Um, Now, it has slid ever since, although it didn't slide too much until this past time around. So just real quickly,
Hmm.
1972 it was fifth, 1982 it was seventh, 1992 it was 17th, 2002 22nd, 2012 21st, and then suddenly 2022 72nd. So it dropped 50 places
That
in the last 10 years.
and nobody probably noticed because that was the year that was that the year that Vertigo upset Citizen Kane. Or was it?
Actually, that was the
Or was
year
that?
Jean Dielman replaced
Oh, that's
Vertigo.
right. That's right.
So
That's right. That's
Vertigo,
still
I think, was 2002 or 2012.
yeah. Well,
Replaced.
anytime they change up that number one now, they're gonna
Yeah,
grab
that's the
attention.
big story. Absolutely. And also, if I remember correctly, Get Out was, I think, in the top 10, maybe, if
Hmm.
not the top 20, but it was super high up there.
Yeah.
So La Ventura falling 50 places, you know, in my, of course, for me, as it being one of my all-time favorite movies, was a huge, like, what the heck is going on here, which was another reason I was glad that you chose that movie, because I gave you a couple of suggestions for why to watch it, because I want to do whatever I can to help, like, resuscitate this movie and help people see, like, what a brilliant movie it is, and why it's so brilliant. But that's kind of the, sort of the history and background of its critical reception.
Hmm. Yeah, I almost wonder if we don't take enough daring. We don't have enough like daring moves like that anymore. I mean, it's other than Get Out, making it so high on the list and being such a recent film and a horror film. Much more precaution when kind of discussing new films and
Yeah.
putting them talking about how great they are, putting them on lists or whatnot. Yeah, and my reaction was to say like if you wanted to discuss like because you wrote on here like do we take this film for granted now because of how low it's like fallen from the top place and my reaction was sort of like well maybe it's because um so many films have taken from this film and but then you have Jean Dillman as number one which is one of the most meditative
Right.
slowest longest films you can possibly think of so I don't know.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. Uh, and the first thing I'll say is I don't know that there would be a Jean Dielman without La Ventura.
Yeah, for sure.
I mean, of course, I mean that's always a weird thing to say, because of course people would have still discovered new and interesting ways to make cinema, but
Hmm.
La
Someone
Ventura
had to
was
do it first.
definitely, yeah, it was definitely a movie that slowed things down in a way that I think we hadn't seen movies do before. And so, because I was thinking about that question too, it's like, well, what is it about it that, and I thought of, like we talked about these movies. I got a number of movies in my head that I compare to, but when I think about movies that maybe were influential that are less influential now, and movies that are influential and still influential, like two movies that came to mind were Citizen Kane, which you mentioned, and Breathless, which we also mentioned.
Hmm.
So I like think about Citizen Kane, and like Citizen Kane was number one on the Sight and Sound list for a long time. And the thing with Citizen Kane is, as brilliant as a movie as it is, the things that it did that were revolutionary, and first of all, were very obvious. All of this deep focus, deep staging type of movies. Yes, there were aspects of the narrative too, but a lot of it was its style, right?
Hmm.
And its style was something that we hadn't ever really seen to that extreme before. After Citizen Kane, that style was kind of in vogue for a while in the 1940s, and then it went out of vogue. And I think the thing with Citizen Kane is that in the end, people began to realize like the things that it did that were so groundbreaking were not fundamental changes to cinema, if that makes sense. Everyone
Right.
wasn't going to go make their movie with deep staging and deep focus. It was, I don't want to call it a gimmicky movie because I think it's better than that, but you know what I mean? It was sort of like it was influential, but I think its influences waned because the ideas that it introduced weren't fundamental to the nature of cinema, right?
Hmm.
Then I
Yeah.
think of Breathless. Breathless also did things that were very obvious, right? That were very on the surface in terms of its jump cutting
Yeah.
and its handheld camera and its shooting in the streets in a way that was not to say it was the first movie to do that, but using these much smaller cameras that people hadn't really been shooting a lot with, and so you know the effects of Breathless were also obvious in the way that Citizen Kane's were, but I think that the things that Breathless did are still influencing cinema now. You know what I
Hmm.
mean? Um, the fluid, the playing with editing and the playing with sound and the going out into the street, like, and almost the sort of a documentary style applied to narrative, like that's still stuff that we see today, right? That's
Yeah.
still, I think, very influential in cinema, but it's also stuff that you can see, right? it's it's
Hmm.
it's kind of obvious to people.
It's
I
attention
think,
getting.
yeah, exactly. I think, and if we dig in just a second into La Ventura, what we're going to find is that the things that it did are fundamental to cinema now, that they're everywhere, that we just expect a lot of what La Ventura did, but it's more subtle. It's not in your face in the way that Breathless was. Um, it's it's deeper, it's a little more fundamental. I mean, there are things that are on the surface about its composition and stuff, but I think it's deeper, it's harder to pick up. And so I do think in a way there's sort of this weird, one, we don't notice it, but two, we take it for granted because we just assume that what La Ventura did is part of what movies can do. But I'm not sure anyone thought that movies could do what La Ventura could do before Antonioni made La Ventura, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and not having seen this before, but at least like reading about it or hearing about it, people always talk about how the sort of plot of this movie is a woman disappears and her friend group sort of search for her. Really, that's the maybe first 40 minutes of the movie, and the ideas of having sort of presenting a mystery but not resolving it, and really presenting something that is meant to be meditated on and studied through its cinematography. Can you talk a little bit sort of about that? Because that was something
Yeah,
very sort
yeah.
of
So I think, yeah,
unknown or surprising to me about this film.
yeah. So I think there's a couple of things that happen with that. So yeah, of course, what you referred to. I think is the most famous aspect of
Hmm.
what La Ventura does, which is it sets up what seems to be the protagonist, this character Anna. She is um, dating and the fiance of the major male character Sandro, and then she has a friend Claudia, and the three of them are going on a cruise with some of their, I shouldn't say a cruise, a boating trip with
Yeah.
some of their rich friends. Basically, go
Hmm.
to an island. Anna disappears, and it seems like it's going to be maybe a little bit of a thriller about Anna's disappearance. And after Anna disappears, they search for her for a while, and then Claudia and Sandro, her best friend and her fiance, kind of just stop searching and fall in love with each other. Literally days
Hmm.
later. Like, I mean,
Yeah.
this isn't months later, this is days later. They just kind of give up on the search. Not completely. They're still sort of searching, but they're not really searching. Um, and so yeah, so first of all, we've got that big surprise. Now we have to say another movie, if I remember correctly, that came out in 1960 was Psycho,
Hmm.
Alfred Hitchcock's movie, which actually does a similar thing with its protagonist. So I don't
Hmm.
know that Antonioni. I mean, obviously they were separately breaking new ground by doing that, but once Anna disappears, Claudia, played by Monica Vitti, who I think is one of the great actresses of the 20th century, becomes the protagonist of the movie, right? And so the movie does make you question, like, well, what happened to Anna? Where did she go? Why did the movie make her disappear and then sort of just drop her storyline, right? I mean, I think
Hmm.
that's something that you're always going through. But then the other part of it is you've got basically the second half of the movie is this romance between Sandro and Claudia. And Sandro's kind of your typical guy, he's just sort of like, well, there's nothing we can do about it. Anna's gone, and if we are
Hmm.
in love with each other, we should do that. And he doesn't seem too chuffed or worried or stressed about any of it. Whereas Claudia kind of goes back and forth. She's sort of
Yeah.
like, I love this guy, but I feel really guilty. Now I'm happy. Now I'm feeling guilty again. And she kind of goes back and forth. And so that's the plot on the surface, right?
Right.
Um, and it's unusual, but I don't think in and of itself it's something that's going to make people go in 2 years, wow, this is the second greatest movie ever made. uh,
Yeah.
so I do think there is more going on under the surface that we need to talk about.
I sort of read it as an almost metatextual narrative, in that it almost seems as though Anna, um, frustrated or bored of the film she's in, abandons the
Right.
film, and Claudia, who is supposed to be a supportive player, is all of a sudden forced into the role of the main character, of the love interest, and she's fighting against it the rest of the film. And even the way that the other characters react to Anna's disappearance is almost sort of like an annoyance, not like a genuine concern. It's almost
Yeah.
a sort of just a frustration of like, this isn't how this film was supposed to go.
Well, and that sense that you talk about the way everyone sort of gives up on Anna, I think is sort of our way into what is really special about La Ventura. So, you know, for most of cinema history leading up to 1960, whether it was Hollywood movies or whether it was foreign movies, movies are a visual medium, right? And
Mhm.
so movies focus on the external. They focus on action. They focus on what characters do. And that's primarily what a lot of movies still do today. I mean, that's what most Hollywood movies do, right? Um,
Mhm.
we focus on the external. Well, at some point, especially I think after World War II, people started wanting to focus a little bit on the internal of characters. Um, and so even, you mentioned neorealism. Well, even after we came out of World War II and we had neorealism was all about the external lives of characters, right? It was about their social conditions and their societal conditions and what was happening in their lives and what their lives looked like on a day-to-day level. Well, then I think that probably the big person, I'm not saying that other people weren't doing it, but the big famous person who came along and said, you know what? I think movies can explore the internal of characters was Bergman, right? So
Mhm.
Ingmar Bergman came along and especially in his movies in the 50s, he started wanting to ask bigger questions, right? Ask questions that were more about the internal lives of characters. But the thing is that most of the time, if you want to explore the internal lives of characters in a movie, well, movie's a visual medium, so you still have to find a way to externalize the internal, right? And it's also a sound medium, or at least it was a sound medium after 1930. And so if you look at Bergman's movies um, in the years before that, like let's look at 1957, another great year. He released both The Seventh Seal and Wild Strawberries.
Those came
Seventh
out the
Seal.
same year.
Yeah, they
I
both
think I
came out.
realized. I don't think I
Yeah,
realized they were the same year. It's amazing.
yeah. So Seventh Seal, is a knight who is questioning, life and death.
Yeah.
Why do we live? Why do we die? Right.
Hmm.
Um, Wild Strawberries is about this professor at the end of his career who is traveling back to the university that he went to be honored. And as he's going on this road trip, he's going through like the town he used to live in, and he's reminiscing about his life, and he's also sort of having visions and dreams about his past life, right? So both of these movies are kind of digging a little more internally into their characters, right? But both of them are very, even though they're sort of saying, hey, let's dig inside of a character, Bergman is externalizing everything that they're going through, right? I mean, so how does the knight contemplate death? Well, he literally plays chess with a robed figure carrying a scythe, right?
Right.
Practically.
Hmm.
He plays chess with death, and he talks to death about death. He prays to God about death. So everything that's internal is externalized, right? And then you look at Wild Strawberries, and the same thing happens. He talks to other characters about how he's feeling. He has dreams and visions where he's basically working through, even though it's sort of dream imagery, it's pretty clear dream imagery that he's thinking about his youth, and he's having these flashbacks where he's thinking about missed opportunities and all these kinds of things. And so again, the movie is externalizing the internal, right?
Hmm.
Through very obvious things like dialogue, right? Um, and then Antonioni makes La Ventura, and we've got these characters, Anna, Sandro, and Claudia, and they have internal lives. They are struggling with things, especially the women, right?
Hmm.
Especially Anna. In the first 30 minutes, she clearly is struggling with something that she can't name, right? Something that she
Yeah.
can't quite identify. She doesn't see her fiance that often, and she both doesn't like that, but also doesn't really want to be with him, and she can't figure out why, right? And then we've got Claudia, who 3 days after her best friend is gone, is falling in love with somebody. right?
Mhm.
And clearly there is something going on with her. And even the characters around them, like you said, they're these wealthy characters primarily, they kind of don't really seem to care, right, about what's going on around them. And so there is something internally happening to them. What's really unique about Antonioni versus everything that had come before is that he doesn't externalize really those internal struggles. He doesn't have them tell you what's going on, right?
Mhm.
He doesn't have Anna just say, oh, this is what's bothering me. Yes, Claudia is feeling guilty, but there's something deeper going on and she can't figure it out. And the movie doesn't tell you what it is, right? And it's the same with the other characters. Um, and so, what I think you figure out, but you don't figure out because anyone told you. You figure it out through context. You figure it out through shot composition. You figure it out through cinematography and mise en scène. Is you figure out that these characters are trying to figure out meaning, right? And this becomes, I think, a very big post World War II kind of thing. Like, what is the meaning of their lives? They seem disconnected from each other, they seem disconnected from the world. The big term that's always been used in relation to this movie is alienation, right? They
Yeah.
seem alienated from each other and they seem alienated from the world, right? And so suddenly he's sort of referencing these deeper aspects of these characters. He's talking about their internal lives, but he's not answering any questions for you. You know what I mean? He's not giving you the answers to what is ailing them. He just lets you have to live with the movie and ask that question yourself, right?
Yeah. I think the movie though is also it's I think it's was clearly read when it came out and is still kind of seen as a critique of the bourgeoisie, or at least the bourgeoisie lifestyle. So even though we're not getting those sort of stock answers, we are sort of being, I think, led to believe, or at least draw a conclusion to it being this sort of the emptiness of these people's lives is that they have nothing else, nothing really important going on, or at least no sort of like
Yeah,
important or sincere relationships with one another.
I think that's a tricky part of it because you're right. He is focusing primarily on wealthy characters. Although Sandro, I think we would say, is upper middle class. Claudia does tell us that she doesn't come from money, but obviously has been accepted into these circles. So
Yeah.
you're right. There is this complicating factor. We're not looking at characters from the lower class characters who are poor, presumably because they don't have time to
Yeah.
think about these kinds of things.
Lay around on boats and
Right.
be
But
bored
I
by.
but I also think that he kind of had to choose those characters. That is, I don't think that it's just their wealth that he's critiquing. You know what I'm saying? I
Mhm.
think that he is pointing to something about the modern condition, about the way the world is changing and how rapidly it's changing, that is causing these characters to feel disconnected. And maybe the wealthy feel it first because they
Yeah.
have more time on their hands, but
Right.
I think everyone's going to feel it eventually. Even when we look at the other characters, I shouldn't say the other characters because they're not really developed characters, but you know, we meet a pharmacist and his wife that they go looking for Anna to, and they're unhappily married. Um, an American kind of Kim Kardashian type character, but who is a prostitute, comes to town, and the whole town goes bonkers. There's just
Mhm.
hundreds and hundreds of men, literally rioting in this town. Um, then there's a scene where Claudia herself is sort of wandering around a town by herself, and all of these men come out. And yeah, there is something
Yeah.
about
It's like
a
the rare
sexism.
sort of really surrealist
Yeah,
scene almost.
but there is also like none of these like none of these people seem to have anything going either.
Mhm.
Those characters seem to be the townspeople. They seem to be lower to middle class, and they also seem to be unable to treat another person as a human being. They seem directionless, like they have no meaning in their lives. And so when some beautiful woman walks through, they literally practically lose their minds over her, right?
Yeah.
So yes, you're right. I think there is something about the upper class and the bourgeoisie, but I think that when you watch it in its totality, it's just about a malaise of society. It's not just a
Mhm.
malaise of the upper class. It's a malaise of society. Um, and I
Uh,
think, yeah, go ahead, go ahead.
I was just gonna say though, there's a line that jumped out to me, and I wrote it down, and it's when Claudia is talking about sort of how this how she's like struggling to even care about Anna's disappearance, and she says everything is becoming so hideously easy, and I was like,
Yeah,
oh, that feels like a lot of double meanings, or at least multiple meanings in that one line. And it
yeah,
made me think of like times in my life when, even though I've never considered I've never been have the luxury of being as wealthy as these characters, but I live in America, and I do have a certain amount of privilege, and there's been
right,
times in my life when I've felt that sort of like uh, that sort of guilt, or whatever you want to call it, of being in a privileged position and wondering, having that sort of malaise of being frustrated with my own purpose, or
yeah,
whatever you
yeah,
want to call it.
absolutely. Um, and so, a couple of thoughts on that. One is, I think that first of all, this identification of this malaise that was infecting modern society, one, I think is incredibly prescient in the fact that 65 years later, and this is the 65th anniversary of La Ventura, um, I think we're experiencing it more than ever, through, I
Hmm.
mean, not to say that he knew that social media was coming, but in a sense could see where modernity was going, that we would become increasingly disconnected from each other, and
Mm,
lacking in empathy, and that would become more and more of a struggle, and that it would become shockingly easy to not care. And I mean, we see it in our politics right now, in terms of what we're seeing with our government and with Trump, and with trying to get people to care and to vote for more than just what
right.
benefits them economically, right?
Or even to engage in what's going on, or to even agree in what's going on.
Yeah, absolutely. But going back to then to what was unique about this is, you know, the movie is there's almost, I want to say subtext, because I think there was probably subtext before, but having kind of this other subtextual layer throughout the entire movie of this malaise and this alienation was not something that had really happened in movies before, in the sense that you as an audience had to figure it out, right? Um, and you had to sort of ask the questions. And it's really funny because, you know, you can just take everything for granted that happens. But I think, if you think it's just about a movie about like two bad people who like forget about their friend and their loved one and just fall in love with each other, I think you're doing the movie a disservice, because I think the
Yeah,
question you're supposed to be asking, that Antonioni wants you to ask, is why, right?
right.
Why is Sandro? Well, first, why is Anna acting the way she is? Why does she disappear? Why does Sandro immediately turn his attention to someone else? Why does Claudia, who seems like a really good person, fall in love with Sandro? Like, why are these things happening, right? And so you're forced to ask yourself that question and dig more into the movie, and again pay attention to all these subtle things that give you answers, like the mise en scène, like the compositions of the shots. There are some dialogue hints too, and so the movie makes you work in a way that I don't think people had really experienced with the movie before. Um, so I
Yeah, if you're not
mentioned this.
asking those questions, you're probably going to boo it.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly. Um, so I mentioned why, and I think this word why is sort of fundamental to understanding. Because we didn't ever ask why before, right? Like, you'd watch a movie and the whys were explained to you, even in great movies by someone like Bergman. And I love Wild Strawberries and I love Seventh Seal, but the whys were still pretty obvious, right? And now we
Hmm.
get this movie where the whys are not obvious. So I'm going to ask you a question. So this is the jelly bean in the jar question. So in Italian, why is perché, right? So this is
Mhm.
something that the characters say. And at the beginning, Anna, if you remember when she goes and she's making love to Sandro while Claudia's waiting for them to go on the boat, she says, perché, perché, perché. And she gets really
Mhm.
angry. She does it 6 times in a row. So I'm going to ask you, how many times do you think a character says the word why in La Ventura? Like, how many times total do you think a character utters the word why?
Oh, my instinct is to go lower, but I think I'll take a shot above and say 37.
73.
Oh, I knew it. I was backwards. I was like, I'm probably gonna
Three
undershot it by a
times.
ton.
Now, they're not always asking why. Sometimes the character says why as a
Uh,
declarative, as a statement. This
right,
is
right, right.
why. But the word why appears in this movie 73 times. And just to give you an example, I did the research on all these other movies we've been talking about that came out around the same time. Um, and the next closest is this Seventh Seal. Why do we die? Right.
Right.
Um, and the number of whys is right about your answer, something like 35.
Wow.
Um, so so perché the characters say this 73 times in the movie. In case you're wondering how I know this, by the way, I actually downloaded the subtitle files for all of these
Oh.
movies, and then I just opened them in a text editor and did a search, and it tells me exactly how many times every character said why. Um, but in particular, in La Ventura, each character has a key moment where they say why is this, so we mentioned Anna saying it at the beginning, um, when um, Sandro is talking about his job as an architect and giving up the creative side and just doing estimates for people. He says why, he says 3 times in a row, why am I doing this, right?
Mhm.
um, and then actually Claudia has a why too. She only says, well, she says it multiple times, but there's one key time where she's around the same time she's with Sandro in a hotel room and she's like, "Tell me you love me." And he says, why should I
Right.
say that to you?" And she says, "Why?" She just says why, and then she says, "You're right. There is no reason for you to say that to me." And that's her key why, right? And
Mhm.
so so there are dialogue hints, but it's sort of like, yeah, it's these big questions of why, right? Of why the characters do these things. And that leads you to all of these things about alienation and disconnection, and these characters who are floating through life having lost a sense of meaning, having lost a sense of connection with each other, which is why the ending of the movie to me is so beautiful and so brilliant, right?
Mhm.
So at the end of the movie, they sort of stumble across their friends at this hotel. Um, Claudia's tired and she goes to bed, but she can't sleep because Sandro has gone off, to hang out in the lobby in the dining room with all these other people, and she can't sleep because of it. So she wakes up and she's tossing and turning, and she starts looking for him like at 4 in the morning, and she eventually finds him, and he's cheating on her. He's making out with the American prostitute that we'd seen earlier in the movie, and of course she's betrayed, and she runs off, and then
Mhm.
Sandro runs off and follows her, and they both go outside, and the sun is rising on Mount Etna in Sicily, and Sandro sits on this bench and he's crying, and I don't even know if he knows why he's crying. I think he's crying
Mhm.
because he's lost, because he doesn't even know why he did this.
Yeah.
Because because he I think he thought he loved Anna, and I think he thinks he loves Claudia, and so now why is he doing this? He doesn't know, um, and he's so disconnected from everything, and everyone's all about themselves, right? And Claudia is crying too, and the choice that she makes, she could walk away, she could do all this stuff. Sandro's sitting on this bench crying, as she walks up behind him and she puts her hand on the back of his head, and she just touches him, and then it goes out to this wide shot and the movie ends. and it's like someone has figured something out, right?
Mm,
Claudia has found some sense of meaning, which is true connection with other people. Even when they betray you, even when they do something bad,
yeah.
it's about how you connect to other people, not just for what you will get out of it, but her understanding that he's in as much pain as she is, and he doesn't understand why, and she tries to comfort him. And so that ending, I think, is just so beautiful, and it's a weirdly optimistic ending for a movie that feels very pessimistic all the way through. Amazing one moment where this character sort of has a breakthrough in a way. And again, she doesn't say anything, she just touches him. And we have to
Mhm.
understand what that touch is supposed to mean.
Yeah, we talk about a little bit about sort of like, is this an intellectual film? Like, should you go into this like I mean, you can definitely go into this, I think, diving into the cinematography and analyzing everything, but it's also an emotional film. And when I was watching it, I was kind of trying to figure things out a little bit more, at least to be better equipped at a
Right,
conversation.
right.
uh, but I kind of like gave into the movie at a certain point and just said like, okay, I'm just gonna kind of go on this emotional journey, at least wherever this film takes me. And by the end of it, you do kind of like are really not sure what. At least I was not sure what to feel at the end of it, but
Yeah,
I knew I just needed to kind of sit with it for a while. And I did end up like listening to the commentary for this film, and there was a lot of analyzing of the cinematography. Antonioni had a lot of knowledge of composition and painting, and so many of his shots are have a lot of like double meaning in the composition.
yeah.
And I don't know. I'm wondering what you think of whether or not we are supposed to recognize that, or at least are we supposed to intuitively know it, or at least
I think there's a
how much
couple of
how
levels to
much
that.
does he
Yeah.
want us to know?
I think there's some levels to that, and I think that's part of why people call it an intellectual movie. Because look, on just the most basic level, I don't think you need to have a lot of knowledge of cinema to recognize that it's a beautiful movie, that it's a beautifully shot movie. Even if you just watched movies and then you look at the close ups in this movie and you look at the wide shots and you look at the way how clever it is. And maybe you need a little bit of an eye to notice,
Hmm.
sort of some aspects of the way that there'll be something happening in the foreground and something happening in the background, and a character will sort of walk in a frame in the background and a character in the foreground, and what's going on between the two of them becomes important, right?
Hmm.
And so on one level, you've just got beautiful cinematography that's incredibly well composed. And by the way, you also have Antonioni breaking rules. He's got all kinds of characters who are in the very edge of the frame, whose
Right.
heads are popping up from the very bottom of the frame. And so he's doing
Crossing the 180-degree rule.
yeah, he's doing all these things that break the rules. But then you're right. Then he starts doing more things that are happening on a deeper level where that are maybe more intellectual. And so you mentioned the commentary, and one of the things that the film critic Gene Youngblood, who does that commentary, mentions right at the beginning with Anna, where we've got Anna and her father talking, and her father is got an old Italian dome behind him, a building that's hundreds and hundreds of years old,
Hmm.
and then Anna is standing in front of a new apartment building construction, and it's sort of like she is associated with the new modern, and he is associated with the old, right? And we
Right.
and we see the changing of Italy, and that requires a little more like okay, you know,
That's I think that's a little bit a lot more of like something that's not going to be as recognized possibly by modern audiences, or at least like
right,
people who aren't
absolutely,
really looking for it. And we talked earlier about films that have like Citizen Kane, for example, that are much more external and showy. And I'm thinking about like that dome probably would have been like much more prominent in the shot,
right,
like there
right,
he would have really like drawn your attention to it.
yeah,
And
absolutely.
Antonioni's not as concerned with that.
No, he's a lot more subtle with it, and the same with I think another thing that we do see more in movies now. I think like Old Boy does a lot of this kind of thing where you do a composition at the start of the movie and you do a similar composition later in the movie. And the idea is that if you notice that, you tie those two shots together, even if they took place an hour and a half apart. So, for example, when Anna and Sandro are making love early in the movie, we've got this, crazy composition where Anna and Sandro's heads are at the bottom of the frame, kind of sticking out of the frame, and the top of the frame is completely empty. Um, and then when Sandro and Claudia finally get together and they find themselves in this empty town and they're wandering the town, they end up kind of hugging and falling onto the ground. And we get the same initial shot. We get the same thing that sort of ties what's happening with Sandro and Claudia to what's happening with Sandro and Anna, where we have this really unbalanced shot where their heads are just at the bottom. But unlike the first one, where that's all we get, we then get kind of more sort of Claudia ends up on top of Sandro. And so we get these beautiful horizontal close ups where her face is completely filling the frame and it becomes a more balanced, beautiful composition. And we see that she is fulfilled in a way that Anna wasn't, right? And so that kind of reading of these compositions, you're right, I think is not, it's something that is still present in cinema, but it's not something that most people tend to look at.
Mm-hmm.
So on a circle around back to that question of like, why maybe is La Ventura not as appreciated now? And I think you get both answers. One is that audiences are kind of not used to doing that level of work, right? They're not
Right.
used to seeing that level of visual subtlety and that level of connection, that visual literacy of really seeing what all of these shots are doing. So on one level, we are just sort of out of practice of doing that. Then I think the other thing is that that idea of an internal level or of another layer is actually very common now. We actually see that a lot in movies. Now,
Mm-hmm.
Hollywood movies still, I think, make things obvious, but we're used to now looking for, we mentioned Get Out. It's obvious, but there is a whole other level, right? And it's sort of this metaphorical level of what's happening in the movie and how, you
Yeah.
know, and so we're kind of used to this idea that movies can explore the internal. And in fact, even in Hollywood movies, we expect every character not only to have an external goal but to have some sort of internal goal, right?
Yeah.
Now it's usually communicated to us in some way, but we're now used to that internal. It comes with the territory, but it didn't in 1960. I think it was still relatively new, so we both take for granted what Antonioni was doing, and also at the same time, I think other aspects of what he was doing are so subtle that we've kind of lost track of them.
Yeah. I think we also are as audiences partially drawn, or at least like like intense film watchers who are composing the sight and sound list are looking for um either bold strokes or intense emotions. I was thinking about Picnic at Hanging Rock while watching this, and
Yeah,
because that's obviously like a film influenced by this. And that film is almost the opposite, where characters mysteriously disappear and it sort of drives everyone insane.
yeah, yeah,
And the answer or the lack of answers brings out intense emotion,
right, right.
whereas the opposite happens here. The emotion is almost completely in some
Yeah,
ways
and
drained.
you mentioned a movie like Jean Dielman, and that's a movie where emotions are played very flat pretty much most of the
Hmm.
way through the movie. But you're also right that it swings big, right? I mean, it's a 4 hour
Yeah,
movie in which almost nothing happens.
but then something does.
Something does, right? Yeah, so it's slow cinema for a while. I mean, it's been a while since I watched it. 3 hours and 50 minutes, and then
Uh-huh.
and then right at the end we get this big moment. Um, so yeah, so you even that movie, in being subtle on one level in terms of its emotional expression, is completely obvious in what it's doing that's different and original, and people are like, this is what makes this movie great, is it's this 4 hour slow cinema that suddenly has this burst of emotion at the end, right? It's easy
Mhm.
to identify that. I think La Ventura is just, in a lot of ways, everything is so subtle about it. And again, like I said, some of those subtleties now we're so used to that we take for granted. Other subtleties we've sort of lost, and we see him again sometimes. Like again, if you go to Old Boy, you'll see that Old Boy is filled with parallels, with
Yeah.
shots that are mirrored from the start to the finish. But even that, if you're a casual moviegoer, you probably don't notice a lot of those. Like you have to watch that movie
Hmm.
multiple times or have someone point out to you those connections, right? Because I think that's not really what's popular in movies right now, is to
Yeah.
really use the visuals at that kind of complicated level.
Well, now that we've sort of at least found possible reasons for it sliding down the list, why do you think it should stay at the top? Like what still grabs you about this film?
I mean, in a way, everything that we said. I mean, I think the fact that it does have that internal level, that it is so subtle with a lot of it, that its message 65 years ago, I think, is still as relevant or more relevant now than it
Yeah.
was in 1960. I would love to see people have a sense of beauty and aesthetics in movies. I think that's been sort of passe for a long time now in movies. Not to say that we don't have beautiful moments and beautiful shots, but the idea of beauty in art, I think, is something that, especially in an era where people want art to be maybe more political, has been sort of shoved off to the side. But I think beauty is an important part of art, and I hope that maybe we get back to that more. And I think La Ventura can sort of help lead the way with that in terms of its its compositions and its mise en scène, and everything that it does. And I also, in particular, I think it's worth mentioning, and remembering who some of the great actors of the 20th century were. In the United States, we tend to focus on people like Meryl Streep and Katharine Hepburn and the great American actresses, but I think Monica Vitti was one of the great actors of the 20th
Yeah.
century. And we mentioned Bergman. Liv Ullmann is another one. I mean, I'm getting a
Hmm.
little off here. I think Liv Ullmann was probably the greatest actor of all time.
Hmm.
But Monica Vitti is great. So I think there's these things that, you know, I think we always have this sense that we're supposed to progress with art and progress with movies, right? That we're supposed to move forward with things and that things are supposed to change. But I don't know that that's true. I think
We're
that's,
all about looking back here.
well, we are about looking back here, but modernism kind of created that myth, that, well, we have to sort of shatter the previous generation's sort of version of doing things and come up with a new way of doing things. I don't know that art progresses. I think art, swings back and forth, and
Yeah.
and I think that La Ventura has a lot of great things that I would love to see kind of come back to cinema, and I would love to see a return to sort of an art cinema and a more subtle cinema. And of course, there's lots of reasons why that doesn't happen, and it's not just because artists don't want to do it. It also has to do with society, with distribution, with money, with capitalism, all kinds of reasons why maybe we don't get those kind of movies. But but yeah, I would love to see that kind of subtlety, those kind of compositions, that kind of interiority. I think they're all fantastic.
Well, you should definitely keep showing it to your film students, and I'm sure it will inspire some of them. This is a
I
film I can. This is a
Yeah.
film I can definitely see like a large group of film students booing like they did at Cannes, but maybe a precious few of them really latching on to.
Yeah, and it is. I mean, it's also, and I can be guilty of this too. It's a movie you probably need to return to. It's probably a movie
Yeah,
that benefits from a second or third viewing, but people
yeah.
don't necessarily want to do that
I
anymore. It's
I
a
wrote
harder
down
thing
a.
to ask audiences to do. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially now with 100 years of cinema behind us. I wrote down
Right.
a quote from Roger Ebert, who admitted not connecting to the film when he was younger and then saw it again 15 years later and thought it was contrived and then saw it again as an older person and kind of
Right.
sort of finally clicked with him. He had a very specific take on it, which I wrote down, but I think we've talked a little bit about whether or not it applies exactly.
Yeah, and I get it, and you're right. I think part of it's about repeat viewings. Part of it's about being a
Mm-hmm.
mature, educated viewer. But part of it, I imagine, for Ebert too, is that as he got older, the world became more like the world of La Ventura. And my little
Sure.
note in response to your quote is, "Aren't we all Anna, Claudia, and Sandro now?" In the sense that we are, I think, all living in a world where our connections are now virtual and through social media, and that makes it harder to create meaning and find meaning and not feel alienated. And I think the things that Antonioni was picking out in the modern world, have are at their worst. I mean, in the 60 years since he made that movie, 65 years since he made that movie, those kinds of concerns, I think, are an all-time high for humanity. And that's another reason why we should watch it, because I think it reminds us of that, and maybe hopefully can give us some thoughts, and maybe the ending can give us some inspiration, even as subtle as it is, about what we need to be doing, um, even if it's just doing what we're doing right now, which is having a conversation about things,
Yeah.
and not just
That's what it's all
tweeting
about.
or putting a one line comment about something, on Instagram that we either love it or hate it, and, hearting it and liking
Sure.
it instead of actually being able to talk about it.
Yeah. All right. Well, Bruce, thank you so much for joining me.
It's been
Is
a
there
pleasure. Yeah. Thank you so
is
much.
there tell me what you would like to promote or would you like people to go to?
Yeah, so the main thing I want to promote, is I do have a Substack. It's called thehutchfiles.com. You can subscribe for free. And so I do a lot of like narrative breakdowns, mostly of like Hollywood type movies. But I
I'd say
also,
some on the Twilight films, I believe.
yeah, we finished doing all the Twilight movies. Sometimes I have some of my students do them as well and post those. So we did all the Twilight movies. I recently did Back to the Future. I might write up something on La Ventura, because I also kind of do some other things with it as well. Um, so that's one of them. And then the other one that's coming right now, it's just got my own stuff on it, but it's called the Palm Street Collective. So if you go to palmstreetcollective.org. Right now, it's a place that you can see all my movies, including my feature, Mountain Flowers. But it's also something that I'm hoping to sort of make into a grassroots platform for other people, maybe whose movies are kind of outside the normal boundaries of even what's playing at film festivals, and things like slow cinema, which Mountain Flowers very much is. And um, if you made La Ventura today and you couldn't find a home for it, I want you to have a home for that. So again, right now it's just my movies, but I would love to start featuring other people's movies. So you can kind of go check out what I've got. And I've sort of got a mission statement on there as well. So again, it's thehutchfiles.com and palmstreetcollective.org.
All right. I will have links to those in the description of this episode. We love old movies, and I'm sure you do too. If you're listening to this, you can reach out to us through Classic Cinema Society pod at gmail.com. Please let us know what you thought of this film. Make sure to subscribe and share this podcast. One of the best ways to help us is to leave us a 5-star review. It really is the best way to help us reach more classic fans, movie fans like you.